Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am joined by James Howard Kunstler, a critic of the cornucopian techno-utopianism. He's written many books on technology, on peak oil, and we're here to talk specifically about technology and peak oil and how his thought has developed over the years. So beginning in 2005, you wrote your book, The Long Emergency. And what's interesting in 2005, we might say that's peak what you call techno-cornucopia thinking or cornucopianism. And so the idea here is that you are criticizing a concept that you call techno-grandiosity, where you have the idea of more technology will solve more of technology's problems. And in 2005, that was the big deal. And it looked like you had all of these great, wonderful future ahead of us, all these new technologies. You know, you had the idea in 2013 of drones being delivered by delivering packages, stuff that never happened. And it looks like 17 years on that the people who were skeptical, like you, were right about the limitations of technology. So how did you see in 2005 what so many people didn't see and say the unpopular thing that it was so unpopular to say?
Well, I wouldn't say that I have any kind of supernatural ability to foresee the future or anything like that. A lot of the things that we're talking about seemed self-evident to me at the time. And by the way, I published a later book, which was kind of a sequel to The Long Emergency, called Too Much Magic. And the subtitle was Wishful Thinking, Technology, and the Fate of the Nation. And that was 2011 or 12 or so. So that kind of updated what I was thinking. Some years before I published The Long Emergency, an anthropology professor from the University of Utah named Joseph Tainter published his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. And one of the main ideas in his book was that overinvestments in hypercomplexity would produce diminishing returns, meaning they would have a negative effect rather than a positive effect. And what we're seeing are simply a whole lot of overinvestments in complexity heaping up and creating distortions and imbalances in the complex systems that we've set up to run our lives. And these imbalances and distortions are mutually ramifying all of the systems so that they're all kind of wobbling at the same time. And you could see how that was going to work pretty easily. You know, one of my more fun observations back then in the early 2000s was we had this idea, this tech idea that we were going to create something called an intelligent highway. And the idea with that was that you'd have computers embedded in the highway somehow, and every car would have a computer in it to communicate with the highway. And that would allow everybody to drive their cars like 5 inches apart so you could cram more cars on a California freeway. And the whole thing was absurd because, for one thing, it assumed that everybody would have that computer in their car. You know, just like today, we assume that everybody's got car insurance, when in fact, you know, something like 10 or 20% of the people in California are driving around without insurance. So you could see how preposterous these schemes are. By the way, we abandoned that intelligent highway idea pretty quickly. And now we've segued into the idea that we're going to just change out the internal combustion engine for electric cars. And that isn't going to work either for a whole bunch of other reasons. And in fact, I think we're starting to kind of shy away from it. You don't hear that much about it anymore as the costs of doing it and the difficulties, or shall we say impossibilities of doing it become more manifest.
Right. Well, one interesting thing as well, especially in your book, Too Much Magic, the way you analyze the problem is more all-encompassing than the way it's normally split down the right-left divide. So, for example, you spend a lot of time talking about financial collapse and political collapse in a way that's similar and analogous to what we might see with the prepper community. We also see you talk about the collapse of moral law and judgment with regards to finance, but the society as a whole with the idea of, something for nothing and the rise of gambling, which is sort of a conservative concern. And then you have concerns that are more traditionally of the left, ecological collapse, corporate tyranny to the workers. and government tyranny. And so you have this whole expansive analysis that sort of transcends the partisan divide. What makes you different in that regard? Because I've followed this kind of critique for a long time, and you seem to have this more meta perspective.
Well, during this whole period, there's been a tremendous shift in the political spectrum generally. And I don't think that I've changed that much. I'm, in fact, an old-time registered Democrat, voter. And I registered in 1972 for the first time for the McGovern campaign. Looking back on it, I don't know that I would have been that thrilled about George McGovern. But what's really changed is the Democratic Party and the left. They've gone insane. And it's not, a thinking person is really not able to ally himself with that body of ideas anymore. I'm not exactly sure that environmentalism is altogether a left idea. It may have migrated in and out of the left over the years. But I mean, let's not forget Teddy Roosevelt basically kicked that off, and he was a Republican.
Now, in Too Much Magic, you talk specifically about the collapse of law when it comes to finance. Now, to what extent, which you didn't discuss in the book at the time, but 10 years out, to what extent do you see any connection with or identification with the decline in public morals and the rule of law and the decline of religion in America, specifically Christianity?
Well, we were on a track to develop a certain kind of ethos as a nation in 2009, 10, around the time of the great financial collapse and the bailouts. We were on track because when there are no consequences for committing major crimes, you've all of a sudden got a pretty tremendous social and political problem. And no one was indicted for or tried for any of those financial crimes. And it sent a terrible message to the nation. And we developed into a country that basically believed that anything goes and nothing matters. And it's been like that ever since. And, there have been a tremendous number of crimes against the Republic and against the people themselves that have been committed just in the last 5 years that have gone completely unpunished or unattended to. And the problem gets worse and worse and worse. So I think we've kind of peaked on that, and we're now turning in the other direction. And there's going to be a ferocious reaction to that will indeed lead to a lot of adjudication of bad behavior.
All right. Now, also, this is more specifically to your first book, The Long Emergency, within this trilogy of the Emergency Trilogy. You talk about how, with the rise of a technological society and things like suburbia, things like the nascent internet, we have this space that's inhabited that's further and further removed from the real world, walkable distances, real people, real nature. You call suburbia a cartoon of rural living. Now, when I read that, I was struck by how similar it was, in a more abstract way or less concrete way, to Baudrillard's idea of the simulacrum, where you have increasing levels of simulation. To what extent, if any, were you aware of Baudrillard when you were writing that?
Not in the least. No, but these like a lot of the stuff we're going through, it's pretty self-evident. And I was a mature, grown-up person when the internet came along, and I was in a position to evaluate it from an adult point of view through its entire development up to now. And one of the things that was apparent fairly early on is that we were missing a big lesson, which was in our rush into the fiesta of the internet, the intoxicating orgy of alternative space. And the big lesson was that the virtual is not an adequate substitute for the authentic. And it's been a hard lesson to learn. because the dazzle of the internet has been so tremendous, especially the visual imagery that just really gets into our head very directly. And I don't know if we are going to learn that lesson. Personally, I think we've made another basic conceptual error about the whole internet thing and its relationship to our economy and society, which is that it's entirely dependent on a reliable electric grid and a reliable internet, or on the reliability of the internet. And I see both of those situations as being very dicey. The electric grid is, as they like to say, the biggest machine in the world, but it's also extremely fragile and has many points at which it could fail. And I don't know why people assume that the internet is going to be a permanent installation in the human condition. It probably comes out of this, looking at history and seeing how technology evolved, and only being able to imagine that it will get more and more and more elaborate successfully, without imagining that there can be any points of failure along the line. I see some gigantic points of failure, and I wouldn't assume at all that the internet is a permanent installation in the human condition. We're enjoying it right now. It depends on a tremendous amount of complexity, and we're now heading into a period of history that will be characterized by decomplexifying, simplifying, localizing, and the trend is not in favor of the internet.
Well, exactly. One of the things growing up, I read a lot of history, literature, and the Bible, and looking at how modern society is so radically different from how humans have lived throughout most of life. For example, somebody living in 1900 had more in common with somebody living in ancient Egypt than he would have with us today. And then you begin to realize that how different the last century is, and how unusual this is, and how little we have to take for granted whether this continues or not.
That's something that has struck me, ever from before I started the Long Emergency book in the late 90s. It's been obvious that the techno-industrial phase of human history has really been an anomaly. And but when you live through it for 2 or 3, 4 generations, which we have basically, you take it for granted that all those conditions are fairly permanent. And I think my parents' generation actually went through even greater. They saw greater changes perhaps than even I did. These people went from. My parents' generation went from many people not having electricity in their homes and, not having good plumbing, and, the automobile being in its infancy in the 1920s when my parents were children, to, in the middle of their lives, we landed on the moon. And then towards the end of their lives, we were in the, the internet age. And so they saw just mind-blowing changes. And it's really hard to imagine how they work that through their heads.
Well, exactly. And of course, when you live through those changes, it's difficult to see that the law of diminishing returns will eventually kick in. And so you could argue we sort of peaked in the 70s with the moon landing, and then after that we sort of trailed off and are now in a sort of decline, as you've called the long emergency.
Yeah, and a lot of things, the decline hasn't been just a general push towards collapse. It's been a whole bunch of systems and subsystems and governing ideas and principles and things which have entered their own arc of failure at different times, at different speeds. So, you can look at the financial system and see a system that's been deeply degraded. You can see other systems that have not quite caught up, like the oil production system, which, for all of its troubles, is still kind of humming along. So things decay at different speeds, but even at different speeds and at different arcs of progress, they still ramify each other's failures. So we see the failures in the banking system degrading the general morals of the population, for example.
Right. And you see, this is where complex systems collapsing is what it's more broadly called catabolic collapse, because it's not just one system that's collapsing, it's a system of systems. And so while we can project out what it would look like when they all collapse, we can't predict necessarily from now until the final breakdown what the intermediate stage will look like.
Yeah, it's very difficult. There is some basic principle that human beings' brains can only handle so many forces in motion, and attempt to calculate the path of those things. So that in itself is a limitation, and it's hard. And in the meantime, you have to take into account that most Americans, in one way or another, are leading fairly frantic lives, just trying to pay their bills, keep their families together, please the important people in their lives, and all these other things that are just part of normal everyday existence. And it's really quite difficult. And then to expect them to have a philosophical view of the larger course of history is, maybe asking a lot. But that's why we have this thing called a thinking class. The job of the thinking class is to be gatekeepers for knowledge, wisdom, information, and if it's done honestly, to provide guidance for the society. But unfortunately, our thinking class has become the most corrupt of all of the social classes that we have in our society.
But that's actually a good segue. How do you think that happened?
Well, it's hard to say, but I think the idea that comes closest is the idea that's only been introduced into the public arena in the last 6 months, and that's Matthias Desmet's idea of mass formation psychosis. He's a psychology professor and statistician, an odd combination, from the University of Ghent in Belgium. And he didn't originate this idea. The idea itself is not that different from the idea of the madness of crowds, but he's had the factors that bring it into being. And one of the observations that Desmet has made is that the thinking class, people with higher IQs and more advanced degrees, tend to be more subject to this kind of mindfuckery, which he compares to being very similar to hypnosis. And it's interesting that it did happen just at the point where the internet and social media achieved a certain amount of saturation in our culture, through which it was able to mold thinking and opinion, and especially among the educated classes who were especially drawn to social media like Twitter and Facebook. Twitter especially, because it became a jousting yard for intellectuals. And the various factors that Desmet lists for being a precondition for mass formation psychosis are: one, an alienated society, a society of alienated individuals who feel disconnected from any kind of community or group. A second one is a lack of purpose and meaning in their daily activities. If you go to some dumb shit job at, working in the marketing department of Old Navy or, whatever these people are doing. A third one is generalized anxiety about something, and my interpretation is that a lot of people have been nervous and anxious about the course of the economy, especially in the thinking classes, because they own stocks and they do follow markets and follow the banking fiascos, and they're aware of how unreliable these things have become. And I forget what the fourth thing is. I think what it is you need a target for all of those free-floating anxieties. And that's what happened when Mr. Trump came along. He was in many ways an unappetizing personality, with his mystifying hairdo and his childish manner of speech and his prankish personality. And all of that whole package of things really rubbed a lot of the thinking class the wrong way. Now, ironically, he might have been all of those things. He might have been unappetizing for all of those reasons. But the fact was he was providing the nation with something that it actually needed, which was a sense of conserving some of the things that made this country worth living in. And when the thinking class adopted him as their enemy, as their mega enemy, they also adopted their opposition to anything that was good about this country and proceeded to try to destroy it. And it's quite obvious now that we're in, this strange 15-month interregnum of Joe Biden and company to see exactly how capable they actually were of destroying the country, because they're doing a great job of it. And but I do think that they've reached the limit of what they're able to do, and people are on to them, and now all kinds of things are flipping against them. And they're going to have to get their minds right. I don't know how the thinking class is going to recover from this. I suppose that a lot of people are simply going to be discredited, and they'll never enjoy the kind of career that they had before. But this thing is going to turn around, and I tend to compare it to the Jacobin phase of the French Revolution, where for about 1 year in 1793 and 4, you get the ascendancy of this insane political class. The Jacobins wanted to deconstruct French culture altogether, and they started doing things that really disturb people, like changing the length of a week from 7 days to 10 days and sticking an extra month in the calendar, things that were really deeply disorienting to ordinary people. And in the meantime, they managed to kill about 18,000 people with a guillotine through the Reign of Terror, which they carried out. They were the ones responsible for the Reign of Terror. And so, after about 12 months, the country was sick of them and sick of their depredations, and they got rid of them. They cut off the heads of their leaders, Robespierre and Saint-Just. And oddly, the Jacobins and their ideas were really not heard of again until the Bolshevik Revolution, in which we start to see the same kind of behavior. And now, 100 years later, we're seeing that kind of behavior of all places in the United States, where the people who claim to be on the left and the people who claim to be the most ultra-liberal ever are the very ones who want to shut down free speech, shut down the transmission of news and information, and destroy people's reputations, perhaps without a guillotine, but in every other way possible, and destroy their livelihoods and their lives.
Now, what's interesting, you've mentioned already in this conversation the idea that a lot of the techno-grandiosity predictions have been walked back and just quietly forgotten. Now, when Obama, I think it was in his first term, made the claim that America's best days were behind it, and that we needed to accept a lower standard of living. Of course, that ruffled a lot of feathers, but I think one way you can interpret that is the ruling political class beginning to see the writing on the wall for cheap energy and trying to create a political mental space to prepare people for that. Would you agree with that interpretation?
Well, it may be. Yeah, I think that it's definitely a possibility. But then, the Democratic Party, the left generally, went through this weird transmogrification, and they turned into the Jacobins. And it's just one of the peculiarities of human behavior that, we have these kinds of mob behavior and group behavior that can be deeply destructive and deeply undermine human well-being and the common good and the public interest. And that's what happened. Let's not forget that a lot of the recognition of those limits to growth, if we can call them that, because that was the title of a famous book that came out in the 70s that presaged all this. But the recognition of that was probably so disturbing that politicians couldn't really find a way to frame it to make it appetizing for people. And then by the time, and so we go through this weird period from 2009 to 2016 where we're managing to kind of pretend that the system is working through financial legerdemain by quantitative easing and generating huge amounts of new debt to conceal the fact that we can't really cover the costs of running our society anymore, and we have to borrow all this money from the future to keep on pretending that we can do it. And that went on for about, 8 years or so. And then Mr. Trump comes along with a different promise, which is that he's going to make America great again. And, I didn't buy the idea that we were going to, return to 1957 and become this nation of big factories and everything that went along with it. I do think that we're going to have to learn how to make a few things in this country again if we're going to continue to be civilized. And it's not altogether clear how we're going to go forward with that. But for all that, Mr. Trump was not the monster that the left made him out to be. They immediately set into a highly dishonest and seditious program of disabling him with russiagate. And so it's hard to kind of see how his term in office might have turned out if he wasn't being antagonized and pestered for the whole 4 years with all of this nonsense. But that's one of the things that's coming out in the wash now. We are, Mr. Durham out there, the special counsel, is in fact prosecuting a case against the people who started that Russiagate business, and it looks like he's darn serious about it. It took years for that karma to come around and go around and get the people who started it. They probably, I think it's one of the whole Russiagate thing is one of the reasons that the anything goes and nothing matters ethos got such traction, because so many people were able to do so many illegal things and criminal acts, really, and not get touched for it at all, that, a lot of the people in power assumed they could do anything and get away with anything. And they've been doing it ever since. And it's going to prove to not be true. And we're just entering that phase now of, what will be a pretty fierce retribution for all that. It's really going to make a lot of heads blow up as it occurs. Right.
One of the things that you mentioned more directly and specifically in your first book, The Long Emergency, it was the idea that economics needs to shift to a biological, organic way of thinking, so a more bottom-up living organism rather than the cancerous notion that it is now, where you just produce, grow. And as I was reading that, I was thinking, well, obviously this is a sort of scientific analysis of the situation, but it's a sort of analysis and view of reality that fits nicely with Aristotelian thinking, because Aristotle himself was a biologist. Now, whether or not during the long emergency, whether or not Aristotle makes a revival either through the explicit actions of ratiocination or through some sort of implicit trial and error, I think in virtue of it being starting from a similar source, a sort of biological integralism, that it will be an ideology that's more likely to flourish because it's able to deal with the new material conditions.
I do think it's possible that we're going to return to a great deal of classical knowledge and philosophy and actual disposition of views that we have thrown in the garbage over the last 30 years, shall we say, because a lot of those bodies of thought and ethics are based on true verities. And, of course, when anything goes and nothing matters, veritas doesn't matter is one of the things that doesn't matter. And, I think the pendulum will swing back in the other direction. There will still be plenty of books around that contain those ideas, even if the internet is not going. I don't think that I use the word organic because, just knowing myself, and having had sport with the whole organic movement. It's probably a term I wouldn't use. What I have said is that life is going to relocalize and is going to downscale significantly. And what I also said was that societies are emergent organisms. They follow the rules and laws of emergence, which are that many things self-organize according to the circumstances that reality presents at the time that they exist and evolve. So our society is a self-organizing system. Reality is sending us certain sets of instructions about what would be probably the best modes of behavior to address it with. To a large extent, we're not listening because we're stuck in the raptures of mass formation and the transports of wokeism and all these other ideas that really amount to kind of mental illness. But we'll get over it. And when the rubble settles and the smoke clears, we'll follow the path of an emergent society. We'll respond to the signals that reality is sending, and we'll do what's necessary, which I believe is simply going to be, a much downscaled level of human activity and much more local, much less complex. I do think that as the years go by, we'll develop an amazed nostalgia for the wonders of the late 20th and early 21st century, because a lot of them won't be with us anymore, I don't think. What it probably amounts to is a time out from the rigors of progress. It may be a very long time out. Who knows? It might even be a permanent time out. But that's what it's going to be, I think.
Right. Now, what makes your work different than other works of this kind is a more optimistic future. So there's the Teotihuacan, the end of the world as we know it, the Chicken Little syndrome. A lot of people that write in this venue tend to have an end of the world apocalyptic mentality. And you're like, well, hold on. It's going to be bad. It's going to be rough. But it's a transition period. And it's a transition period to something that is not foreign to human existence. In fact, the long emergency will lead to new forms of existence that are very similar to the ones humans are familiar with throughout history. And the way you describe the new local communities of the future, I actually think that's a comforting description of the future, in the sense that someone, again, who's very into history and literature, it sort of brings back to mind these stories and tropes and ideas that we see in the past that we yearn for but don't see in the present.
Well, yeah, that's true. And let's not forget, I wrote a 4-book series of novels called World Made by Hand, and each of the 4 books has a different title. But it was a set of stories set in a post-economic collapse New England town, and an attempt to really depict vividly what it would feel like to live in that new disposition of things. And it wasn't entirely, a feel-good exercise. I had to imagine quite a bit of hardship, and the loss of many things that had been comfortable and convenient for us. But I also discovered in the process that, we were probably going to be also discovering the joys and satisfactions of living closer to other people and working at things that mattered and that had meaning with them. And, a whole lot of other positives about what that new frontier of the human existence would feel like. So, what it really boils down to is, just another chapter in the human project. And it has its joys, it has its sorrows, and the amount of either of them hasn't changed.
Now, I've only read your first one, entitled "The World Made by Hand," and what's interesting is I generally like to read a doomsday scenario books about whatever, financial collapse, environmental collapse, or in this case the long emergency. And what a lot of authors tend to do, and you didn't do, is that there'll be this winner take all World War II scorched earth, or like the good guys just wipe out completely the bad guys, and it's a clean slate. Whereas maybe no spoilers, but when the everything is sort of evened out, the leadership of the protagonists realize we just can't remove everybody we don't like. It's not within our power to do that. We have to figure out how to still live with them. And I think that's a more realistic approach than the way a lot of these stories go.
Yeah, well, thank you. And that's true. And that was all deliberate. And I hope people will read them and enjoy them and get something. I wrote them partly so that people would feel some reassurance about what life would be like after this period of disorder that we're going through now ended. Because the series takes place when things are pretty settled, and the great disruptions had occurred and were pretty much resolved. At least in the corner of the country that these people lived in. And I say that because, as I depict in the novels, communication has gotten pretty poor for long distance, for finding out what people are doing 3,000 miles away. Right.
Now, what's interesting as well is a lot of people who are critical of the modern technological society today come at it currently from a more narrow professional focus, like say someone who, like you, who studied suburbia, somebody who studies biology or environmental systems. But what I find interesting is there's also people that come to this by looking at like a big analysis picture. So I don't know to what extent you're familiar with C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society, or Ivan Illich's Rivers North of the Future. But these are all a sort of expression of a Christian 20th century critique of the modern rise of technology. And it's interesting how, even though they start from different axioms, different starting points, there's a lot of overlapping similarities. So like, for example, C.S. Lewis says that what we call nature is that which we already conquered with the scientific method. It's that which has already been conquered and subjugated that we call nature, and that which is outside of that is something else. And I've heard statements like that very, very similar from Derek Jensen, people like yourself. And it's interesting how there's this convergence point.
Well, one thing that converges, from my point of view, is that when I wrote the World Made by Hand novels, I was conceiving a culture that had lost pretty much most of the scaffold of everyday existence. There were no more corporations to report to work for. There were no more schools. There were no more courts. There were, all of the institutions were blown up and gone. And what did people have left? Well, in my town, all they had was the Congregational Church. And I'm not religious in the least, really. Although, I have my own sense of the spiritual. I was raised in a religion-free household, and that probably accounts for my point of view. But it seemed to me that the church would be the last institution that left standing, and that would be the armature for people's social lives. And indeed, that's how things worked out in the book, in the books, plural. I added another feature to that, which is that into this little town that I've created in fiction, I moved a cult of kind of evangelicals from Dixieland who have moved up north to get away from the disorders of that part of the country, which is depicted as being kind of a wild corner of the country. And they've come up and they've bought the decommissioned high school, and they've started to turn the athletic fields into gardens and orchards and pastures and things. And there's quite a contrast between their point of view and their way of operating and the view of the townspeople who are quite demoralized from the losses that they've suffered, and they're discouraged, depressed generally. But these newcomers are not depressed and not discouraged, and they're very capable of doing all kinds of things to keep themselves going and to create a new economy and to take care of the infrastructure of the town that they've moved in. And so that was an interesting mental exercise for me to go through.
Right. Now, this is an idea I'd like to run by you. One of the things that Jacques Ellul points out is that the technological society seeks to maximize what he calls social plasticity, which is the idea that any sort of concrete, reified relationship, either to the land or to your community or to a religion, gets in the way of the process of transferring ideas which are necessary for the development and accumulation of scientific knowledge, which is what this whole machine is trying to consolidate into itself. And it's that social plasticity which is being stressed and imposed on us, which is creating alienation. Because we're being pulled apart from things that are real and matter, because we and those institutions get in the way of this broader process. Is there anything that you would want to comment on about that?
Yeah, you can see a vivid illustration of it just in the last 2 years, where the public health the public health institutions in America have completely disgraced themselves with the handling of COVID-19. By pushing vaccines that don't work, that harm people, by giving people bad information, and then by going to war with the public over that bad information and insisting that they accept it. And so you can see how, perhaps unwittingly, science in its effort to consolidate all of its power has ruined and disgraced itself, and I don't know how we're going to remedy that. A lot of people may have permanently lost their faith in progress science, medicine. Medicine's disgraced itself. You've got I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of physicians there are out there in America, but only a tiny fraction of them have been willing to look into what the truth of the treatment of COVID-19 is and what the vaccines are really doing to the population. The rest of them are going along like a bunch of lemmings. And in the process, they've thrown the Hippocratic Oath into the garbage can, and they've made a whole lot of people not trust their doctors, and for good reason. So, we can see how this degeneracy, gains hold, and all of it has happened because the authorities have tried to carry out their program in opposition to reality and truth, and that's just a very bad strategy.
Yes. Now, this is, I think, one of the most interesting framings of the evolution of tools, and this fits into the broader criticism of technology. And I'd be interested in what you have to say on this. So Ivan Illich makes the distinction between 3 eras of tools. The first era is what he calls organon, where it's the idea that the tool is the extension of the user, and so the sum is greater than the whole. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So a good example would be any sort of like samurai film where the sword is an extension of the warrior. So they're part of an organic whole, hence the term organon, which in Greek, Plato can use it to refer to the hammer, the hand, or the hand using the hammer. And so the intent is in the user, and then the tool is an expression of that. Then we have the age of distality, where there's a distance between the user and the tool, and now intent is in the tool. So the tool can just... So the sword now is a thing that cuts, not a part of this broader organic structure. Good example of that would be Rey in Episode 7. She just picks up a lightsaber and just uses it. Like, there's nothing to training. And then the third stage of tools is systems, where now man is a part of the broader system and is fit into that. And so now the system, then the tool... So it's first an extension of us, then it's separated from us, and then as it's separated, it subsumes us. Do you have anything to say about those 3 eras of tools? Does that sound something that you would hang your hat on?
I would say it's an interesting framework for understanding the prosthetic extension of being human. I don't have anything against that point of view. It seems to be pretty practical. I don't have much more to say about it, though.
Right. Yeah. So with regards to the long emergency, what do you see? Well, you've already written about what life in it would be like in your 4 books on the long emergency, World Made by Hand. But one of the things that I think it would be interesting to think about here, too, is as things become more local and more organic. As you've mentioned, you'll see the origin of, or revival of more traditional modes of life, because those are going to be the modes of life that are relevant to the new conditions people are living in. Is there anything more you want to say about that you haven't already said?
Well, the only other thing I'd say is we don't know exactly what direction these things are going to take. It's possible we'll end up in something more like The Handmaid's Tale, or it's possible we'll end up in something more like My World Made by Hand. And you don't know. History is surprising, and history is rather prankish. It often takes us in directions that we never would have imagined. So, I mean, I never would have imagined that my America would turn into a country that was attempting to defeat free speech. And here we are, and the most educated classes in America are behind it. So it's perverse. And so history is pretty prankish.
Now, as far as this pivot amongst the thinking class to this new position that you're talking about, one theory that I've heard, and I'd like to get your take on this, is that in 2011, with Occupy Wall Street, there was this sort of peak anti-globalist grassroots resistance. And one of the things that happened was if you looked at all the news outlets, they would talk about things like the banks, or debt, or globalism. And then in 2012, all of that language changed to things like race and sex and gender and culture issues. And so, over the last 10 years, all of these outlets that a lot of left-leaning progressive people were reading shifted the tone of the discussion by shifting the language that they used. So the point that so it's almost like the rug gets pulled out underneath people. You build up trust in these institutions, these media outlets, and then they all get on the same page and change the narrative. And before you know it, people don't even notice what's happened, and now they're anti-free speech. What do you think of that explanation?
Well, what I do think is that a big part of that was simply a hustle. A feature of our economic life over the last 15 years or so has been that many activities have turned into rackets, including some of the least expected ones, like education and medicine, have become among the most corrupt endeavors in our economy. But a hustle is only a racket on the street level. And so the race and gender hustles, were able to come along because so many other things in our culture had turned into rackets, and we'd ceased to notice how dishonest they were. And we did not notice how dishonest, Black Lives Matter actually was, and how dishonest the whole gender mindfuck actually was. So we're now discovering it to our great horror, and we're about to do something about it. We're now doing things about it. We're putting a stop to it. I think one of the themes of the next few years is going to be no more hustles, thank you.
Now, you're famous for your aphorisms, techno-grandiosity, happy motoring. You have a very unique way of expressing your thoughts in print. How did you develop that sort of aphoristic dictionary?
I don't know. Some of the writers that I admired were great stylists. And, one of the things I realized early on as someone who intended to make a profession out of this is that if you can't capture someone's attention, you're not going to really have a reader. You can't be boring. And so I decided to try to develop a prose style that was as bright as and kind of dazzling as possible. So, that's what I set out to do. And I had good models, and and I'm doing okay at it.
All right. Now I have one last question for you. I don't want to take up any more of your time, but E.M. Foster, in his 1909 book, short story, The Machine Stops, in a galactic level of prescience, does predict a vast technological society that we're living in now that then collapses, and what happens to the people that are living inside. And he predicts that most of the people living inside will be so dependent upon this machine apparatus that when it does collapse, the majority, if not all of them, will die. Now, if we look at modern society today with processed foods and antibiotics and the whole galaxy of pills, dialysis and surgery, once all that's removed, how many people today are actually in a position to actually live without the machine, not just in the sense of psychologically, but even just at a material level for their very own existence on a biological level?
I think not very many in Western Civ anyway. I don't know about, India or Indonesia or other places around the world, but not so much in Western Civ. And on top of that, we're now in a situation where I don't want to get too outrageous about this, but it appears that the authorities are even trying to murder the citizens of Western Civ with their vaccines, and we'll see how that plays out. In fact, the whole COVID-19 affair looks ever more nefarious the further we go along in it. But I think it's going to be pretty costly to the people who live in America and Europe.
Well, again, thank you for your time, James Howard Kunstler. Where can my listeners find your work and what you do?
I publish a popular political blog twice a week on Monday and Friday, but not the days in between, at www.kunstler.com, KUNSTLER.com. And my books are on my website. They're at, wherever you can get them, at your local independent bookseller, if you still have one, because there's not that many left, and all the other usual places. And that's where you can find me.
All right. Well, thank you. It was a pleasurable discussion. This is Todd
Okay,
Lewis
Todd.
of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.